Foucault's theory of power. An important aspect in understanding Foucault's projects is to understand his view of power. Foucault's analysis of power are articulated at two levels, the empirical and the theoretical. The first level is constituted by detailed analysis of historically specific modes of power and how these modes emerges out of earlier forms. Foucault identifies modern forms of power such as disciplinary power, biopower, and pre-modern forms such as sovereign power. Three very simple examples can illustrate these forms of power. First, imagine a pyramid with a king at the top, his ministers in the middle, and the king's subjects at the bottom. If the king issues an edict, then his ministers will execute the order, imposing it upon king's subjects. Traditionally, power has been understood as being at the top of the pyramid. Foucault observes that power arises in all kinds of relationships and can be built up from the bottom of a pyramid or any structure. Thus, an academic transcript, the record of students' courses and performance, becomes an instrument of power, but begins from observation at the bottom of the pyramid, unlike an edict which begins from the top. The academic transcript is an instrument of disciplinary power. It serves to make a student regulate or discipline her own performance and behavior. Similarly, observing which groups in the population are most likely to contract a disease can lead to a discovery of its causes. Like academic transcripts, this third kind of power, in this case to save lives by eliminating smoke inhalation, does not require a top of the pyramid to function. But unlike an academic transcript, this kind of power does not directly address particular individuals, but rather groups of people and populations as a whole. This third example is an illustration of what Foucault calls biopower. The second level of Foucault's analysis, the theoretical level, transcends historical particularities or specificities and is common to the diverse modes of power that Foucault has described. What we call a theory of power emerges from Foucault's mid 1970s analysis of psychiatry, prison, and sexuality. This theory is not restricted to descriptions of one empirical period or regime, but describes certain general features of power and its operations across historical epochs and periods. Therefore, the aim of Foucault's inquiries is not to formulate a theory of power, but to formulate an analytics of power. Foucault's theory of power suggests that power is omniscient, that is, power can be found in all social interactions. He writes that it seems to me that power is always already there, that one is never outside of it, that power is omniscient, that is, that power is coextensive with the field of social relations. This does not mean that power functions as a trap. Power does not consolidate everything or embrace everything or answer everything. Therefore, it is very important for us to discuss how not to understand power. Foucault first distinguishes his own theory from three mistaken or misleading conceptions of power. He says, by power, first, I do not mean power as a group of institutions and mechanisms that ensure the subservience of the citizens of a given state. This might remind us the liberal analysis of power. Second, by power, Foucault do not mean a mode of subjugation in contrast to violence. Here, we are reminded of the typical psychoanalytic approaches toward power. Finally, by power, Foucault do not have in mind a general system of domination exerted by one group over the other, that is, class oppression, a system whose effects pervade the entire social body, as in many Marxist views. Therefore, the analysis made in terms of power must not assume that the sovereignty of the state, the form of law, or the overall unity of domination are given at the outset. Rather, these are only the terminal forms power takes. These forms of power, sovereignty, law, domination, may in fact be present in certain contexts as terminal forms, but none are fundamental. The most important misconception is what Foucault terms as juridico-discursive understanding of power. This misconception, deeply rooted in the history of the West, is common to many political analyses of power and approaches to sexuality. Foucault's argument is that this misconception has functioned as a mask by which much of the actual functioning of power is obscured, thereby making many of the actual mechanisms of power tolerable. According to this juridico-discursive theory, power has five principal characteristics. First, power always operates negatively, that is, by means of interdictions. Second, power always takes the form of a rule or law. This involves a binary system of permitted and forbidden, legal and illegal. These two characteristics together constitute the third. Power operates through a circle of prohibition or a law of interdiction. Fourth, this power manifests in three forms of prohibition: affirming that a thing is not permitted, preventing it from being said, denying that it exists. This reveals a logic of censorship. Finally, the apparatus of this power is universal and uniform in its mode of operation. Implicit in this characterization is a distinction between macro structures, the overall decisions, and micro practices, capillary interventions. Now recall our opening illustrations. A transcript would be a capillary intervention or a micro practice, whereas an epidemiological studies of cancer rates reflect macro patterns. Foucault's analysis begins at the micro level and is modified as it encompasses the macro level. Why does Foucault term this view a juridico-discursive representation of power? First, it is juridical because it is modeled upon law or upon prohibition. It is a power or representation of power whose model is essentially juridical, centered on nothing more than the statement of the law and the operation of taboos. Second, power is essentially discursive. Its prohibitions are tied together with what one can say as much as what one can do. In this way, restrictions on language should also function as restrictions upon reality and action. This is the heart of the logic of censorship. He writes, discourses are not once and for all subservient to power or raised up against it. Discourse can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. Foucault's own theory of power is meant to replace these juridico discursive accounts. He writes, it is this image that we must break free of, that is, of the theoretical privilege of law and sovereignty, if we wish to analyze power. We must construct an analytics of power that no longer takes law as a model and a code. What then is a Foucauldian view of power? Foucault's view of power uses empirical analysis to discover a new theory of power, which will in turn provide a new framework for subsequent historical analysis. Here, Foucault tells us how one should understand power. There are at least three ways to understand power. He writes, "It seems to me that power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. Two, power must be understood as the process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them. Three, power should be understood as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another. And finally, power should be understood as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law, in the various social hegemonies." This quote indicates four principal aspects of Foucault's approach to power. We have a set of force relations, processes by which these relations are transformed, systems or distinctions that are constituted by the interplay of these force relations, and large strategies or terminal forms with general and institutional characteristics that emerge from these relations, processes, and systems. He begins at the micro level, looking at local relations of force rather than at the macro level of hegemonies and states, which can only be fully understood as functions of the local relations. In other words, Foucault begins with individuals' behaviors and interactions to see how larger patterns and eventually national norms or regulations grow out of them. First, then power must be understood at the micro level as relations of force. It is in this sphere of force relations that we must try to analyze the mechanisms of power. Force relations seem to be the basic unit. They consist of whatever in one's social interactions that pushes, urges, or compels one to do something. We should note that Foucault speaks of power relations in terms of force relations without reference to a source or agent. Three features of these force relations can be understood. First, there is a multiplicity, that is, many different relations of force intersecting and overlapping in our social interactions. Force relations may have different specific characteristics or impact. Second feature suggests that force relations are immanent in the sphere in which they operate. That these relations are immanent means that they exist only within a certain domain or discourse. In other words, they are not concrete like bodies but incorporeal like the laws of physics. They are nevertheless genuinely present, and like laws, their presence can be felt in very concrete ways. Foucault thus describes force relations as a substrate. It is the moving substrate of force relations which, by virtue of their inequality, constantly engender states of power, but the latter are always local and unstable. This means that power relations are not outside but rather immanent in other kinds like economic, knowledge, sexual relationships. So, power is not an institution or a structure, nor an individual capacity, but rather a complex arrangement of forces in society. This has an important corollary. Power is omnipresent because it is produced from one moment to the next, at every point, or rather in every relation from one point to another. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it becomes from everywhere. It even shapes our choices of how to dress on a daily basis. The third feature in this initial characterization is that these force relations constitute their own organization. On the one hand, these force relations are the immediate effects of the divisions, inequalities, and disequilibriums which occur in relationships. But on the other hand, force relations are intelligible. This is not because they are the effect of another instance that explains them, but rather because they are imbued through and through with calculation. There is no power that is exercised without a series of aims and objectives. These calculations, these aims and objectives, which Foucault will refer to as tactics and strategy, constitute the internal organization of power relations. Several other aspects also emerge from this core understanding of power. Foucault describes five of them. First, since power emerges in relationships and interactions, power is not possessed but exercised. Power is not the privilege acquired or preserved of the dominant class, but the overall effect of its strategic positions. At stake here are two competing models of power, one based on a contract and the other based on perpetual battle, strategies, or war. Foucault's analysis of power presupposes that power exercised on the body is conceived not as a property but as a strategy. Second is reiterating the point about immanence. Power relations are not exterior to other relations. Third, power comes from below. That is, there is no binary and all encompassing opposition between rulers and the ruled at the root of power relations and serving as a general matrix. So, power is not reducible to a binary relationship. Power comes from below. It emerges from a variety of overlapping and intertwined relationships rather than from a sovereign individual. That power comes from below means we cannot best understand power by looking at the top of any chain of command. We must look at the complex webs of interwoven relationships, what Foucault calls the microphysics of power. Power develops in the first instance in specific local individual choices, behaviors, and interactions. These combine in myriad ways to constitute larger social patterns and eventually yield macro forms which one typically thinks of when one thinks about power. Just as everyday objects are constituted by atoms and molecules, we thus have a micro level of individuals, disciplinary techniques of the body, and a macro level of populations, biopolitics. The final proposition that emerges from Foucault's conception of power is that power relations are both intentional and non subjective. There are several misunderstandings about Foucault's analysis. First, power is intentional. Power relations are imbued through and through with calculation. There is no power that is exercised without a series of aims and objectives. Foucault refers to these aims and objectives as tactics and strategies. These are what constitute its rationality. But power, he insists here, is also non subjective. But this does not mean that it results from the choice or decision of an individual subject. The problem here, the apparent paradox, is that according to Foucault's description, power has to be exercised by someone or something, but if it is non subjective, there cannot be a someone exercising that power. Foucault seems to be erasing agency an individual's capacity to choose and act for themselves, or rather locating this capacity to act in a non-corporeal power rather than in individuals and institutions. This can be resolved with two observations. First, part of his point here is that the effects or the exercise of power reach beyond any individual's or group's intentions or control. Foucault is arguing against the view that the state acts as a monolith, or he is arguing for the importance of micro events with their ripples and interactions in order to understand macro phenomena. This means that local actions often have unintended macro consequences, and that one's control of macro processes will always be limited and incomplete. Macro phenomena result from the concatenation of many micro events, but they are not the direct result of any particular individual action or choice. This is then an argument for a system level rather than individual level understanding of power relations. Foucault's distinction between tactics and strategy parallels this micro macro distinction. Tactics are local, micro, and strategies or macro, systemic. The second observation to be made here is a logical one. To understand subjectivity as constituted through power relations is not to deny that subjects can act intentionally. You still choose what you will wear each day, even if those choices are conditioned and limited by the strategical situation in which you find yourself. Those who understand the claim that individuals are constituted by power relations to constitute a denial of freedom find his vision to be bleak. Those of us, on the other hand, who find in his analysis the tools with which to increase our self awareness and hence our own freedom, hear wellsprings of hope in his discussion of the continuous transformations of power through history. Power is always accompanied by resistance. Resistance is, in fact, a fundamental structural feature of power. Where there is power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. Without resistance, without two bodies or minds pushing and pulling against each other, there is no power relation. And through resistance, power relations can always be altered. This fifth point encapsulates each of the preceding four. Power is exercised, first proposition, in the very interplay of force and resistance. This interplay is present in all social interactions, second proposition. Force and resistance are manifest even in micro interactions between individuals as well as states, third proposition. And while each person may choose to apply force or resist, the ultimate outcome of the relation cannot be controlled by one party. Power is intentional and non subjective, the fourth proposition. In a 1984 interview, Foucault emphasizes that in the relations of power there is necessarily the possibility of resistance. For if there were no possibility of resistance, of violent resistance, of escape, of strategies that reverse the situation, there would be no relations of power. He adds that there cannot be relations of power unless the subjects are free. If there are relations of power throughout every social field, it is because there is freedom everywhere. Now, let us recall where we began. Our discussion so far has focused only the first point, that power consists of multiple force relations. The second aspect that Foucault identifies here is that these force relations are processes, not static, and are constantly being transformed. These transformations take the form of ceaseless struggles and confrontations between the original force and its accompanying resistance, and sometimes strengthen the power relations, but sometimes weaken or reverse it. These processes also produce a number of interrelationships and systems as various power relations reinforce or undermine each other. Foucault introduces a distinction between tactics and strategy. Tactics are the local rationalities of power in particular cases. Strategies, on the other hand, are the larger systemic or global patterns of power. These strategies are built out of combinations and concatenations of those local tactics. The rationality of power is characterized by tactics that are often quite explicit at the restricted level. When they are inscribed, tactics which becoming connected to one another, attracting and propagating one another, but finding their base of support and their condition elsewhere, end by forming comprehensive systems. These comprehensive systems or strategies constitute institutional crystallizations out of the interaction and combination of locally fluid power relations and become recognizable terminal forms like the state and other types he enumerated. The movement of Foucault's analysis here is from the micro level to the macro, from the molecular to the everyday, from specific individual force relations through their processes of transformation and the networks or systems that their interplay produces to their larger strategic manifestations in the state, the law, and other hegemonies such as ownership of the means of production. While strategies may be one dimensional, the networks of power taken in sum are multidimensional and cannot be reduced to only one strategic mode, juridico-discursive or otherwise. Foucault's point is that while they may have adequately described some particular strategy or terminal form of power, each approach fails to grasp the fundamental form or operation of power at the molecular level. But as Foucault reminds us again, analysis of power must begin not with these end forms but with the moving substrate of force relations, which by virtue of their inequality constantly engender states of power.